A victim of pedophile football coach Barry Bennell has revealed he is 99% certain former Wales boss Gary Speed suffered the same abuse as he did. Bennell, 64, is believed to have preyed on as many as 114 young footballers during a 20-year reign of abuse as Crewe's youth team manager. He was yesterday found guilty of the final 7 of 50 child sex charges he will be sentenced for on Monday. It will be his 4th jail term for similar crimes. A new documentary tonight uncovered one victim's account, which claims he was in the same bed as Gary Speed while the pedophile coach abused him. The former Wales manager committed suicide in 2011. He played for Crewe's youth team at the same time Bennell was in charge, but told police he hadn't suffered any abuse. His father Roger said the same thing, insisting at the time, "I don't think so. Gary wouldn't have it. Honestly, no way. He was old enough in the head, even at that age he knew what he wanted. He was a clever lad." But now the unnamed victim claims he was abused, telling Channel 4 Dispatches, "Football's wall of silence. Barry would abuse one of us, then turn over and then abuse the other." Asked if he is absolutely certain that Gary Speed was abused by Bennell, he replies, 100%. Well, 99.9%. Yeah. Another of Speed's teammates tells the program how Bennell showered Speed with gifts and took him on football tours and holidays. He says, "I saw Gary come and go in Barry's life. If you ask me, I would tell you that Gary will have suffered abuse at the hands of Barry." Gary Speed, happily married and former star at Newcastle, Leeds and Everton, was one of 4 men coached by Bennell who went on to die of either drink, drugs or suicide. He hanged himself at just 42, leaving his family, friends and fans devastated. Mark Owens died from long-term problems with alcohol complications in 2016 after he told police he was abused by Bennell, but before he gave a formal statement. Stephen Prince died of a drug overdose in 1991 and Mark Hazeldine killed himself in 2006. Gary Cliff, now 47, yesterday waived his right to anonymity to speak out about the horrendous abuse he suffered at the hands of Barry Bennell. In 1981 he was 11 and a huge Manchester United fan, but after impressing at Crewe, he was scouted for one of Man City's junior teams. It was there he met his abuser, who joined as coach a few months later. Bennell, who was yesterday convicted of the last 7 of 50 allegations against him, wanted to meet and greet the young players, inviting them to his house 2 by 2. During these trips Cliff was abused hundreds of times. Asked how many times he fell victim to Bennell's abuse, he told The Guardian it would be impossible, but over a 4-year period, virtually every weekend, every school holiday, and I'd even miss school on some occasions. We'd be talking about hundreds of times. Hundreds. At a conservative estimate, Cliff, now a detective constable after a change of career, is determined there are more victims yet to come forward. He told the newspaper it's documented that he's been abusing since the 1970s all the way through until he was arrested in the 1990s. It straddles 3 decades and he's been involved in football all that time. So you have to say there will be hundreds of boys affected. Another victim spoke of the 4 men's deaths during Bennell's trial this week, saying, 4 people from teams I have played with Bennell have taken their own lives. Whether they have taken their lives due to Barry solely, I don't know. But all I know is how it's had an impact on me and how it could impact on other people. He said he wanted to get in touch with Speed's parents after he read in the paper that they had not been able to get closure because they had no explanation for his death. Prosecution junior counsel Owen Edwards told the jury at Liverpool Crown Court in all 3 cases there were coroner's inquests at which evidence was called. There was no evidence called at any of the inquests suggesting that their death was linked to Mr. Jones. Bennell changed his name to Richard Jones. Speed's inquest heard that he was found hanged after rowing with his wife. He and his wife Louise had been going through ups and downs but were working through their problems, she told the hearing at Warrington Coroner's Court. The couple, who married in 1996, were arguing against a background of stresses connected to his job managing the Welsh national team. Cheshire coroner Nicholas Reinberg was told they had words in the hours before the father of two was found dead at 7 a.m. after returning home from a dinner party at a friend's house. Recording a narrative verdict, Mr. Reinberg gave the cause of death as hanging but said the evidence does not sufficiently determine whether this was intentional or accidental. When the latest allegations emerged against Bennell, Speed's family issued a statement in which they said he knew Bennell through football connections but he was not a victim and played no part in the investigation. They added, the Speed family have been assured that the police investigation at the time was exceptionally thorough and there is no legitimate reason to link Mr. Bennell to Mr. Speed. Barry Bennell's trial at Liverpool Crown Court heard from 3 former junior footballers who are planning to sue Manchester City, Crewe Alexandra and the Football Association for failing to expose his crimes. Lawyers have estimated such victims could receive up to £250,000 in compensation each if the clubs are found liable. In 2016, a former director at Crewe said the club had been warned about Bennell but they let him stay on as coach. Prosecuting Bennell in 1998, Lord Carlisle of Crewe accused the club of brushing it under the carpet. At the time, Crewe denied any knowledge of Bennell abusing players and offered its deepest sympathies to all his victims. The Guardian claimed Manchester City ignored warnings about Bennell in the late 1970s. General manager Steve Fleet said it was general knowledge he was abusing players. This led to a QC-led review of whether he did use his position to facilitate the abuse. It is still ongoing. But in a statement released yesterday, the club offered its heartfelt sympathy to all victims. Gary Speed and Mark Hazeldine both had the world at their feet, but both were found hanged years later. Was it after abuse by Barry Bennell? The evidence suggests yes, says Deborah Davies, who investigated the paedophile coach 20 years ago. By Deborah Davies for the Daily Mail. 2 boys, 1 team, same coach. What happened in the years after that photograph was taken gives it an almost unbearable poignancy. On February 18, 2006, Mark, 36, who had a brief career as a youth player with Burnley, hanged himself. 5 years later, on November 26, 2011, Gary Speed, the 42-year-old former captain and then manager of Wales, was found hanged in his garage. Did Barry Bennell abuse them? If so, could the sexual abuse they'd suffered have been a factor in their deaths? Our investigation. Wall of Silence, a documentary broadcast on Al Jazeera Television and Channel 4 last night, drawing on over 20 years of research, suggests the answer to both is yes. In 1997, I made a program called Soccer's Foul Play for Channel 4's Dispatches, which broke the story of sexual abuse in football and identified Bennell as one of 3 paedophile youth coaches at clubs in the UK. We named Gary Speed as one of several stars discovered as youth players by Bennell, although there was no suggestion that Bennell had abused him. Our findings suggested a fundamental failure in football to protect young players from predatory paedophiles. Yet the program went out to a deafening silence from players, clubs, and the authorities. Today I understand why. According to experts, most men who have been abused as children seem unable to talk about their experiences until they reach their 40s. Certainly, back in 1997, no professional players came forward to share what had happened to them as children. It wasn't until November 2016 that ex-professional Andy Woodward, then 43, gave a newspaper interview in which he revealed the horrific abuse that Bennell, by then a convicted pedophile, had inflicted on him as a child of 11. His courageous action gave others strength to speak out, including his former Crewe teammate Steve Walters and then England caps David White and Paul Stewart. Suddenly, it was a national scandal affecting players in clubs all over Britain. That led to people to start wondering again about Gary Speed's death. Speed's suicide had stunned the footballing world. A Premiership legend with Everton, Newcastle and Leeds before managing Wales, he had been married for 15 years and was father to 2 sons. He had received the MBE and was a regular TV pundit. Why would such a glamorous, successful and respected man kill himself? Family and friends have been at a loss to explain it. They have always dismissed suggestions he was abused by Bennell as a youngster and reiterated that in a statement last night. Speed himself denied it on 2 occasions to police when Bennell was being investigated in the late 90s. But then so did many other men who've since come forward to disclose childhood sexual abuse, unable to talk about it in their younger years. 3 weeks ago the rumors surfaced again when Speed was named at Liverpool Crown Court as one of 4 players coached by Bennell as boys who had killed themselves. The implication was that Speed had indeed been one of Bennell's victims, although the prosecution made clear that there was no evidence suggesting that his death was linked to Bennell. Our findings from several sources, including a tape broadcast for the first time, suggest differently. In March 2012, 4 months after Speed's death, Bennell spoke to a journalist unaware that he was being recorded. "You can't have peace if you've killed someone," he says. "For me, killing somebody's what you've done to them because their life's never the same." Asked specifically about Speed, Bennell says he may have referred to Gary being a bit special. That description alone provokes nightmarish memories for some of Bennell's victims. The coach would call them special when he showered them with gifts, took them on foreign trips and then made them sleep in his bed, where some were indecently assaulted and others raped. Bennell then denies anything happened with Speed, but adds ominously, "If I did, would I tell you? Then I'd be touted as the cause of his death." In Wall of Silence, Speed's former boyhood teammates speak from their own experience of being a special one while being abused and of seeing Gary treated in the same way. One man tells us, "Because I'd seen a pattern emerging with other young people. If you ask me, I would tell you that Gary will have suffered abuse at the hands of Barry." Direct testimony comes from another man who describes Bennell's vile habit of making 2 boys share his bed at the same time. On a few occasions Gary was in the same bed. Barry would abuse one of us, then turn over and abuse the other. Basically the same process is happening to that other person. When I ask him if he's certain that means Gary was being abused, he says 100%. Well, 99.9%, like Gary Speed's family. Mark Hazeldine's family have never known why Mark hanged himself. But his mother Margaret told me that it was while watching TV reports of Bennell's arrest in late 2016 that she made the link. In 1982 Bennell took 12-year-old Mark on a football trip to Spain. "Straight away it came into my head that Mark went away with him and had something happened," she said. When Mark returned, say friends, he was a changed boy. He became aggressive and turned to drink and drugs. Best friend Anthony Etches says, "I now believe Mark was repeatedly abused and so many years later he's not been able to deal with it." For the program we investigated 2 other deaths. One man told police he'd been abused by Bennell as a child. Before he could give a statement, he died from problems linked to alcoholic liver disease. Another, a former Crewe youth player, died from a drug overdose at 20. He had been sacked after Bennell claimed he'd stolen money from the changing room. Other players confirmed they'd seen Bennell do that to punish those who tried to escape his advances. What has struck me returning to this story 20 years on is the long-term psychological impact of such abuse. Almost every victim I spoke to has revealed suicidal thoughts. Others talk of the overwhelming sense of guilt they'd felt as they watched Bennell groom younger boys to replace them, and not spoken out guilt for their fathers who delivered them for coaching to the door of a pedophile every weekend. Guilt that they'd never been able to tell their partners the source of their nightmares, and when all of that built into an unbearable weight. It is understandable that suicide, even for a brief moment, may have seemed the only way out. But we couldn't mention suicide without dealing with the rumors about Gary Speed and Mark Hazeldine. Many of Bennell's victims tell me they hope he dies in jail, and for them that will be justice, but justice has been denied to those who've died. Margaret Hazeldine says it goes beyond personal grief. "I am so angry at these people in the clubs for letting that go on," she said. She is right. There truly was a wall of silence protecting him. Of course, no one can truly know what made Gary Speed take his life. His father has said it would be easier if the family understood why. And one of the reasons that people agreed to speak to us about him was because they hoped, however difficult it might be to hear, and however much just one factor in the tangle of misery that leads to suicide it might, at last, give his family some closure. Deborah Davies is a reporter with Al Jazeera's investigative unit. Samaritans can be contacted on 116 123 or through samaritans.org. Many people were warned. So how could this vile pedophile have got away with his crimes for so long? F.A. Manchester City and crew Alexandra are accused of failing to stop predatory football coach Barry Bennell by Liz Hulfor. The Daily Mail. The FA and two professional football clubs were accused last night over the failure to stop a predatory football coach who can now be exposed as one of Britain's worst pedophiles. They were accused of ignoring a string of warnings over the behavior of Barry Bennell, 64. Following his conviction on a total of 43 sex abuse charges relating to attacks on 11 boys. It can now be revealed that police are investigating up to 86 more victims targeted by the monster, who has already served jail time for abusing another 16 victims. It means Bennell, who was said to have an insatiable appetite for young boys, could potentially have abused more than 100 victims. He is likely to die in prison, however, at the conclusion of his trial. Several whistleblowers came forward to allege bosses at both Manchester City and crew Alexandra, where Bennell coached, and at the Football Association were warned about his behavior, but hushed it up or failed to act. On a dramatic day, campaigners and victims likened the scale of Bennell's offending to that of Jimmy Savile at the BBC and accused clubs of putting their reputations ahead of boy safety. Manchester City revealed it had identified a second abuser operating at the club as part of a £1 million 50-year review into sex abuse. Former Wales manager Gary Speed's parents confirmed their son was interviewed by police investigating Bennell but insisted he was never abused. As well as the 43 charges he was convicted of, Bennell admitted 7 more relating to a 12th victim at the start of his Liverpool Crown Court trial. The latest convictions represented the 4th time he has been convicted of serious sexual offending, including child rape, following cases in Florida and Chester in 1994, 1998 and 2015. During the 5-week trial, the jury heard that he abused the boys, aged between 8 and 15, in his car, at his home, and on football tours between 1979 and 1991. Many plan to sue the clubs. Victim Gary Cliff, who was molested while at Manchester City, said, "If those in positions of responsibility had challenged Bennell, hundreds of wrecked lives could have been saved. They buried their heads." Steve Walters, who was abused at crew, added, "For years hundreds of us were groomed in plain view. Our abuse is punctuated by the failure of adults to protect innocent children." 4 players coached by Bennell, including Speed, went on to take their own lives. The jury were told, however, the court heard that there was no evidence to link their deaths to Bennell. Speed's mother, Carol, 72, of Queensferry, North Wales, said last night Gary was interviewed twice by police and said nothing had taken place. "That's all we know. He was not coached by Bennell for very long. Her husband, Roger, 74, added, "I was there every time Gary was with Bennell. I am confident that nothing happened. I am positive," Gary would have said. It was reported that Bennell swapped young victims with other pedophiles, including Frank Roper, a football scout who abused England star Paul Stewart. Roper died 11 years ago, in the early 80s. Cancer patient Bennell also allegedly teamed up with pedophile coach Bruce McLean, who was jailed in 1997 at Manchester City, where Bennell was an unofficial scout from 1982 to 1985. Rumors were apparently rife about his behavior, but he was such a good coach that nobody wanted to listen. Former FA youth coach Steve Fleet said it was general knowledge that Bennell was dodgy. He told Sportsmail, "You'd hear it on the coaching circuit. Don't touch him with the barge pole, there's something not right about him." It was the gossip. It was nauseating. The kids would all follow him. The way he spoke to them, it was like baby talk. He was too familiar with them. Fleet, 79, said he passed on his concerns to Ken Barnes, the club's chief scout who died in 2010. "The only confrontation we ever had was over Barry Bennell," said Fleet. "I told him I can't work with him. I put my job on the line. I think Ken thought football was a man's game where it couldn't happen. Maybe he was naive." Police who later interviewed senior management at City for Florida investigators said the club was evasive when quizzed about the reasons for Bennell's 1985 departure. Bennell moved to League Two outfit Crewe, where for the next 7 years he groomed boys on an industrial scale. Lord Carlisle, QC, who prosecuted the 1998 case against Bennell, accused Crewe of brushing abuse under the carpet. Both Crewe and City are conducting their own investigations and have cooperated with the Cheshire Police inquiry. Sources say more prosecutions could follow. Last night Crewe insisted it had no idea Bennell was a child abuser until he was convicted of raping a boy of 13 in 1994. Manchester City extended its sympathy to victims as it revealed it had identified another abuser, John Broom, who was operating at the club in the late 1960s. The FA urged anyone affected to contact their inquiry team. Kim Harrison, a specialist abuse lawyer from Slater and Gordon, said, "Serious questions need to be asked about how this dangerous rapist was allowed to carry out years of abuse on so many young boys in plain sight, much as Saville did at the BBC." Bennell will be sentenced on Monday.